ADX Florence, often called the Alcatraz of the Rockies, is the most secure federal prison in the United States, built to hold the nation's most dangerous criminals in near-total isolation. But deep within its concrete walls lies a little-known area nicknamed the feeding room. It's where certain inmates, those deemed too violent or unstable, are fed without ever leaving their cells or having contact with staff. Meals slide through steel slots, often cold, tasteless, and deliberately minimal. Guards monitor the process from behind reinforced glass, treating food not as nourishment, but as another form of control. One infamous case involved an inmate who went on a prolonged hunger strike to protest conditions. Instead of negotiations, officials resorted to force feeding, strapping him to a restraint chair, inserting a tube through his nose, and delivering liquid meals directly to his stomach. It was clinical, silent, and humiliating, a method criticized by human rights advocates, but defended by the prison as necessary security. Inside ADX Florence, even eating becomes a psychological battle, a reminder that control, not rehabilitation, is the real diet served behind those walls. If you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit subscribe, like, and comment, because what happens inside these walls rarely makes it out alive. This is how it all started. They call it the Alcatraz of the Rockies. ADX Florence, a place designed not just to confine, but to erase. A high-tech tomb for men the government never wants to see the light again. Hidden deep in the mountains of Colorado, surrounded by razor wire, motion sensors, and sniper towers, this is where America sends its most dangerous terrorists, serial killers, cartel leaders, and those who broke prison itself. But there's a room here, one almost no one outside those walls has ever seen. A place where food becomes punishment, where the act of eating something so basic turns into a weapon of control. This is the story of the feeding room, and of one man who dared to fight back. The prisoner was brought in shackled head to toe. They called him Marcus, though that wasn't his real name. He'd been moved from another federal facility after assaulting a guard, a one-way ticket to ADX Florence, the end of the line. From the moment the transport van stopped at the gates, Marcus knew this wasn't a prison, it was a machine. No shouting inmates, no chaos, just silence. Every sound echoed. The jangle of keys, the hiss of hydraulics, the metallic click of a cell door locking for what could be eternity. Inside his cell, he found what all ADX prisoners find. A concrete box, 7 by 12 feet. A bed made of poured stone. A steel toilet bolted to the wall. And a narrow slit for a window that shows only a slice of sky, high above the desert dust. Marcus would spend 23 hours a day in that cell. 1 hour for recreation. Alone, in a concrete pen no larger than a dog kennel. Even his meals arrived through a slot in the door. Hot or cold, edible or not, it didn't matter. The tray wasn't a meal. It was a message. You don't decide when or how you eat anymore. We do. ADX's feeding process was mechanical, stripped of all humanity. Guards never spoke. Cameras never blinked. And if an inmate refused a meal, the system noted it, silently building a record for what would come next. Marcus began refusing his food, first out of anger, then as protest. He said he wouldn't eat until the lights in his cell stopped burning 24/7, a small demand that grew into defiance. Days passed, then weeks. His body weakened, but his mind sharpened. The hunger strike spread, too, then 3 other inmates joined. Each tray left untouched was a small act of rebellion inside the most controlled place on earth. But ADX doesn't negotiate with hunger. They wait. They monitor. And when the time comes, they feed. Most prisoners never see it. Most guards never talk about it. But deep beneath one of the ADX corridors is a narrow, sterile chamber, the feeding room. It looks like a medical unit. White walls, stainless steel, bright fluorescent lights. But the centerpiece isn't a hospital bed. It's a restraint chair. Leather straps across the wrists, ankles, chest, and forehead. A side table with medical tubing, gloves, and a tall bottle labeled Ensure, nutritional supplement. It's not food. It's control disguised as care. When Marcus' weight dropped too low, they came for him. For officers in riot gear. They gave him a final warning. He stayed silent. And so, they rolled him down the corridor. The nurse slid a thin tube into his nostril, guiding it down his throat. The first time, he gagged and tried to speak, but the straps held tight. Then came the slow, cold sensation as the liquid entered his stomach. No flavor, no texture, just humiliation. Every feeding lasted about an hour. No conversation, no comfort. When it was over, they unstrapped him and left, without a word. That process repeated for days, then weeks. And slowly, the hunger turned into something worse, despair. He realized the cruelest thing about ADX wasn't the isolation. It was how they turned survival itself into submission. They called it medical necessity. He called it torture. And somewhere in the soundproof silence of the most secure prison in America, Marcus made a decision. If they wanted to take his body, they would never take his mind. They called him the Stone because nothing broke him. Not the isolation, not the endless white walls, not even the feeding chair. To the guards, he was just another inmate number. But inside, he had become something else, a symbol. In a place where silence ruled, the Stone refused to crumble. Days blurred together after the first forced feeding. Each morning, guards would slide a tray through the slot. Watery oatmeal, powdered eggs, milk that smelled like metal. The Stone rarely touched it. His body was weak, but his eyes, those were sharp, steady. He started counting the sounds. The clicks of doors, the shift changes, the footsteps outside his cell. Even in silence, he learned the rhythm of control. Voiceover. In a world designed to strip away meaning, observation became his weapon. Every sound, every silence, it all told a story. ADX ran like a machine. At 6 a.m., lights flickered on, the same way, every day. At 7, food trays rolled down the corridor, pushed by unseen hands. At 9, guards did their rounds, expressionless, precise, mechanical. The prison was engineered to break patterns of rebellion. Every door opened by remote. Every movement timed to the second. And yet, the Stone noticed something the system didn't account for: human error. Sometimes the guards' routines changed. Sometimes their eyes hesitated. He saw fear, not in inmates, but in those wearing the uniforms. They feared losing control. When words are forbidden, men find new ways to speak. Inside ADX, they used codes: the scrape of a spoon, a cough at a certain hour, the rhythmic knock on concrete. It was their Morse code for survival. The Stone became fluent. Through walls and vents, messages flowed like whispers through the dark. You still fighting? Still alive. Stay strong. And though he couldn't see their faces, he felt them. Dozens of men like him, reduced to ghosts, still clinging to the last thing they had: willpower. But resistance has a price. When a guard discovered untouched trays stacked under the Stone's bed, the order came quickly: take him back to the chair. This time, the process was colder. No warning, no words, just 4 men in black armor dragging him through the corridor as the walls echoed with boots and steel. Inside the feeding room, everything gleamed, polished, sterile, merciless. He was strapped down tighter this time. The nurse avoided his eyes. The tube slid in, liquid feeding followed. The Stone didn't resist. He didn't scream. He just stared, unblinking, into the lens of the camera mounted above him. That stare was his message. He couldn't speak, but he could still defy. After that day, they changed tactics. They played with his schedule. Lights on longer, no recreation, colder meals. They wanted him uncertain, unsettled. They wanted obedience disguised as health monitoring. But the Stone began writing, not with pen and paper, but with memory. He recited poems in his head. He built imaginary blueprints of his cell. He replayed every conversation he ever had with his mother, his son, his lawyer. Anything to keep his mind from fading. ADX can cage a body, but it cannot fully contain thought. And that realization, that spark, made him dangerous again. Late one night, through the hum of the ventilation system, he heard something, faint, almost human. A voice. Just one word: respect. It wasn't an echo or a hallucination. It was another inmate, maybe 2 cells down, whispering through the vent. And though he couldn't reply, he felt it like electricity. For the first time in months, the stone smiled. Not because he'd won, but because he wasn't alone. Somewhere, others were still fighting the same invisible war. In the administrative wing, prison officials gathered for a meeting. On the screen, reports, vitals, notes from psychologists. They spoke clinically like surgeons discussing a specimen. Subject, the stone. Behavior, defiant, unresponsive. Recommendation, continue medical intervention. To them, he wasn't a man. He was data. But data can't describe spirit. And spirit, in this place, is the one variable no one could predict. Weeks later, something unexpected happened. The hunger strike ended. The others began eating again. But not the stone. He wasn't protesting food anymore. He was protesting control. Voiceover. In his silence, he became louder than any riot. And though the guards would never admit it, they feared what he represented. Proof that even here, inside the most secure prison on earth, the human mind could still rebel. They called him unbreakable. But inside, the stone knew no one leaves ADX untouched. He had survived the feeding room. Now, he had to survive what came next. Because in a place built to erase men, survival isn't victory. It's just the beginning of the next battle. Inside ADX Florence, silence is not peace. It's a weapon. The stone had survived the feeding chair, the hunger, the humiliation. But the next phase wasn't about his body. It was about his mind. They called it behavioral adjustment, a phrase that sounded medical, almost compassionate. But behind those words was something darker, a psychological experiment disguised as care. They didn't want to punish the stone anymore. They wanted to reshape him. It began quietly. His cell lights started to flicker at random hours, sometimes too bright, sometimes total darkness for hours on end. The intercom would click on without warning, filling the cell with static, then silence again. No explanation, no pattern. It was chaos wrapped in routine. The stone kept track of everything. He scratched lines into the wall to mark time, but the patterns broke when the lights did. He tried to sleep, but the silence became too loud. The hum of the ventilation system started to sound like whispers. Whispers that sometimes called his name. He knew the tricks. Sleep deprivation. Sensory manipulation. They weren't beating him anymore. They were dismantling him piece by piece. And that's when he realized ADX Florence wasn't just a prison. It was a laboratory for control. The guards never spoke, but he felt their eyes. Every time he looked up at the ceiling camera, he could almost feel someone watching from the other side of the lens, measuring, recording, studying. He began to imagine them in white lab coats instead of uniforms, noting his reactions every time the lights blinked or the tray arrived late. He stopped reacting. He sat still, perfectly still, for hours, forcing his breathing to match the silence. If they wanted data, he'd give them nothing. He would become the silence itself. Days stretched into something unmeasurable. No clocks, no calendars, no voices. Just the low hum of the vents and the metallic taste of air. The stone began to lose sense of where he ended and the cell began. His reflection in the steel toilet looked like someone else. Thinner, harder, eyes sunken but still burning. The guard saw fatigue. He saw transformation. In that silence, memories started to come alive. The laughter of his son, the scent of his mother's kitchen, the sound of rain on the roof back home. They played in his head like a movie projected against the concrete. He realized memory was the one thing they couldn't confiscate. So he built a world from it, a place to hide inside himself. Each day, he walked through that imaginary home, sat on that old couch, talked to ghosts that felt more human than the men who fed him through a slot. And that world, fragile as it was, became his rebellion. Weeks later, a psychiatrist came. The door opened for the first time in months. A small woman with a clipboard stepped inside, standing just out of reach. She asked questions softly, almost kindly. Did he feel remorse? Did he understand why he was here? Did he want to eat on his own again? The stone didn't answer. He just looked past her, through her, into the corner camera. She scribbled something, nodded, and left. The door sealed again, and the silence swallowed everything. Time lost meaning. He started hearing things, not voices but frequencies. The whine of electricity through the walls, the pulse of the fluorescent bulbs, the faint rumble of distant machinery. He realized even the silence wasn't silent. It was engineered, calibrated to make his thoughts louder, more chaotic. The stone began humming to fight it. A low, steady sound, just enough to remind himself he still existed. It became his anchor, one sound that belonged to him alone. And yet, somewhere in that hum, he began to hear others. A faint rhythm, someone else humming back. From another cell, another man joining the same low tune. Then another. One by one, through the concrete and the vents, the inmates created their own secret chorus. A whispering rebellion hidden in harmony. Guards couldn't stop it because they couldn't prove it existed. To them, it was noise. To the stone, it was freedom. Then just as suddenly it stopped. The intercom crackled. A mechanical voice ordered everyone to cease unauthorized communication. The vents went silent again. But that brief connection had done its damage. Not to the prisoners, but to the system. Because once silence is broken, it can never be fully restored. The stone sat in his cell, breathing slow, unbroken. He thought about the feeding room, the cold metal, the straps, the humiliation. He realized the force feeding wasn't meant to keep him alive. It was meant to remind him that his body wasn't his own. But his thoughts? Those belonged only to him. And so, he started writing again, not on paper, but in memory. Each line, each sentence, carved into his mind like scripture. He built his own story in the darkness, a testimony no one could erase. If they wanted silence, he'd give them silence. But inside that silence, his story would grow louder, more alive. Months passed. His hunger strikes turned into meditation. His stillness became strength. The guards began to avoid his cell, not out of hatred, but discomfort. Something about him had changed. He no longer looked like a prisoner. He looked like a man who had mastered the very system designed to destroy him. They had tried to make him a test subject. Instead, he became proof that the experiment had failed. The human mind, when cornered, when stripped, when silence doesn't die, it adapts. It becomes something untouchable. Inside that concrete box, the stone found something no one expected. Not madness, not submission, but clarity. He whispered into the void, his voice barely audible. I'm still here. And somewhere, through the endless halls and vents of ADX Florence, the walls seemed to whisper back. The silence had finally learned his name. At ADX Florence, no one wins for long. The walls always find a way to push back. For months, the stone had outlasted the system. He had turned starvation into meditation, punishment into purpose, silence into his only ally. But control is a jealous thing, and when it slips, even for a moment, the system will do anything to get it back. It started with the guards. They stopped avoiding his cell. Now, they lingered, watching him through the narrow window longer than before, speaking in low voices he couldn't quite hear. Sometimes they laughed, sometimes they just stared. It wasn't cruelty for sport. It was strategy. They were looking for cracks. One morning, the slot opened. A hand pushed through a tray. Not the usual cold grits or dry loaf. This one was hot. Real food. Eggs, a slice of toast, a small cup of coffee. The smell hit him hard. He hadn't smelled warmth in months. But the stone didn't touch it. He knew better. Everything here was a test. The next day, the light stayed on for 24 hours straight. Then total darkness for another 24. Then the temperature dropped so low he could see his breath. The guards were rotating his conditions, bending time, stretching his senses until he couldn't tell what hour it was, what day it might be. ADX was rewriting reality, and his mind was the paper. But the stone had already learned the game. He began to count again, not seconds or minutes, but breaths. Every inhale, every exhale, a reminder that he still existed. He whispered the words in rhythm. In, out, still here. It became his heartbeat, his mantra, his proof of life. Then came the noise. At first, it was faint, distant thuds, metallic clangs from unseen corridors. Then came recorded sounds, crying, laughter, screaming. The intercom hissed without pattern, flooding the cell with chaos. The stone pressed his palms over his ears, but it didn't stop. The walls were talking now. Every sound engineered to confuse, to unsettle, to make him question what was real. Most men would break. Most had. But not him. He stopped fighting the sound. He absorbed it, let it pass through him like wind through stone. And when it finally stopped, the silence that followed was absolute. Even his own heartbeat felt like thunder in his chest. That night, he dreamed for the first time in months. Not of the feeding room, not of chains, but of freedom. A stretch of road beneath a red sky. The hum of a car engine. The sound of his son's laughter in the passenger seat. It felt real, painfully real, until the lights snapped on again and the dream shattered. He sat up, breathing hard, realizing they had even taken control of his sleep. He decided to fight back, not with fists, but with unpredictability. He stopped following their rhythm. When the lights came on, he closed his eyes. When food came, he ate only what he chose, sometimes a bite, sometimes none. He began moving his bed slightly each day, just a few inches. It was a small act, meaningless to most, but in ADX, defiance didn't need to be loud. It just needed to exist. Then came the visit. Two men in suits, faces blank, no name tags. They spoke softly through the slot. "You're being evaluated," one said. "For transfer." The stone looked up, silent. A transfer sounded like mercy, but he knew better. ADX doesn't transfer men like him. They isolate them deeper. They bury them in layers of concrete and paperwork until even memory forgets. He refused to speak. The men left. Hours later, guards returned. They ordered him to strip, to kneel, to place his hands behind his back. "Standard protocol," they said. But as they cuffed him, he felt it. The tension in their grips, the anger in their silence. They were no longer following routine. They were making an example. The walk down the corridor felt endless. Fluorescent lights humming overhead, white walls stretching into forever. He knew where they were going before he saw the door. The feeding room. But this time, there was no nurse. No medical form. Just a chair. Waiting. They strapped him in again. Tighter than before. The air was colder, the light harsher. One of the guards leaned close and whispered, "You think you can win against this place?" The stone didn't answer. He just stared back, the same unblinking stare as before. And in that silence, something shifted. For the first time, the guard looked away. They didn't feed him that day. They left him there, strapped, motionless, for hours, a punishment disguised as procedure. He didn't scream. He didn't move. He simply waited. When they finally released him, his wrists were bruised, his skin cold, but his eyes burned brighter than ever. They wanted him broken. Instead, they had created something else, a mirror. Because every time a guard looked at the stone, he saw his own fear staring back. Fear of losing control. Fear of what happens when silence refuses to obey. After that day, they stopped experimenting. The noise ended. The lights returned to normal. Even if food came on schedule again. To outsiders, it looked like peace. Inside, it felt like surrender. Not his, but theirs. The stone had reached the breaking point. But it wasn't him who broke. It was the system. Weeks passed in quiet equilibrium. The stone barely moved, barely spoke, but inside, something was changing. He wasn't the same man who entered ADX. He had seen what absolute control looked like, and survived it. He had learned that freedom wasn't about walls or doors. It was about choice, and he still had that. He made a silent vow that night. If the world would never hear his voice, they would feel his silence. He would turn it into legend. Every whisper that passed through the vents, every rumor that spread through the yard, every guard who couldn't sleep after meeting his stare, that was his story now. A story built not on words, but endurance. Inside the coldest place in America, the stone had done the impossible. He had made the silence his weapon. And for the first time, ADX Florence didn't sound so quiet anymore. The echo beyond the walls. They say silence dies inside a cell. But at ADX Florence, silence doesn't die. It travels. It seeps through the vents, through the steel, through the cracks of a system that was built to never be questioned. The stone had become part of that silence. Not defeated by it, merged with it. For months, he spoke no words, made no sound, but somehow, his presence began to spread through the prison like a current. Guards changed shifts faster. Psychologists requested transfers. Even the men buried in the deepest blocks, men who hadn't seen sunlight in years, started to whisper his name. The Stone. It wasn't a name anymore. It was an idea, a warning, a symbol, a reminder that even in a place built to erase you, resistance could still take form. No riots, no noise, just quiet defiance that couldn't be measured on paper. Some inmates began mirroring him. They stopped shouting at guards. They stopped begging for phone calls, for commissary, for mercy. They just waited, calm, patient, eyes fixed on the same invisible horizon. And when the guards passed their cells, they felt it too. The same energy, the same stillness, a kind of power that didn't belong in a place like this. Prison officials called it collective behavioral regression, but inside those walls, it was known by another name, the Stone Effect. The Bureau of Prisons ordered reviews. They wanted to understand how one man, cut off from everything, could change the rhythm of an entire facility. Reports were written, meetings held, data collected, but no one could explain it, because it wasn't something you could document. It was something you could only feel. The Stone didn't care about being understood. He wasn't trying to inspire. He wasn't trying to be free. He was just surviving on his own terms. And that, somehow, became the most dangerous act of all. One morning, they came for him again. No warnings. No riot gear this time. Just 2 guards, a stretcher, and silence. They said he had collapsed in his cell. Malnutrition, exhaustion, maybe both. They moved him to the medical wing, where the lights were softer and the air smelled faintly of disinfectant. For days, he drifted in and out of consciousness. He could feel the tube in his nose again, hear the distant hum of machines, the rhythmic beeping of his heartbeat on a monitor. And somewhere between waking and dreaming, he thought he saw the feeding room again. Empty now, lights off, chair folded and pushed to the corner. Maybe it was memory. Maybe it was a vision. But this time there was no fear. No resistance. Just a strange calm. He remembered his son's face, his mother's voice, the warmth of sunlight on skin. Things that had become almost mythical in his mind. And he smiled. A small, tired smile. Because in the end, they hadn't taken those things away. He had carried them through every cell door, every feeding, every silence. Days later, they said the Stone was gone. No one knew the exact time or even the cause. The official report said cardiac arrest due to self-imposed malnutrition. But to those who heard the story through the vents, the tale was different. They said his heart didn't stop. It simply became too heavy for his body to carry. They said he left the silence behind, and it stayed. After his death, strange things began to happen. Guards refused to work the night shift in his old unit. They claimed they heard a low humming sound, faint but constant, like a man singing under his breath. Some said it was just the air ducts. Others stopped arguing. The feeding room was sealed soon after. The official reason, maintenance and repurposing. But everyone knew better. That room wasn't just a piece of the prison anymore. It had become a reminder of what they tried to hide. Months passed. The administration rotated staff, moved inmates, and rewrote reports. But the story refused to die. It spread quietly, from Florence to Leavenworth to Marion to every prison where men sit alone wondering if the world still remembers them. And when they whisper his name, the Stone, they're not talking about a man. They're talking about what he stood for. Endurance. Silence that speaks louder than screams. The refusal to be erased. Outside the walls, a leaked report found its way into the hands of journalists. It described unauthorized medical interventions and behavioral modification protocols used in ADX. The government denied everything. But once again, the silence began to crack. Families demanded answers. Advocates called it torture. The Bureau of Prisons called it necessary procedure. And somewhere in between those words lies the truth. A truth too uncomfortable to fully face. The truth is this. America's most secure prison doesn't just hold men. It holds secrets. And the feeding room, the one they sealed and forgot, still echoes with the sound of resistance. The stone never escaped ADX. He didn't have to, because in the end, he turned that place inside out. He made them see that control, no matter how total, can never touch the human will. And maybe that's why even now, long after the cameras stop recording and the reports stop printing, the walls of ADX Florence still hum at night. A low, steady sound, quiet but defiant. A sound that doesn't belong to the prison. It belongs to him, the stone, the man who made silence speak. Inside ADX Florence, they build a world without voices, a place designed to erase the human spirit. But they forgot one thing. Silence doesn't mean surrender. Every hum through the vents, every whispered story passed between cells, every moment of defiance in the dark, it all carries his name. The stone may have vanished, but his echo remains. And as long as there are walls meant to break men, there will always be someone inside, refusing to fall.